Welcome to Secure Software Development. We'll begin as we always do with a deep look into how memory works on computers. So over on the left we have our CPU, and over on the right we have memory. Main memory can be thought of as an associative array. It associates an address with memory contents. So when the processor wants to read from memory, the basic process is that it decides on an address which it places on the address bus. A bus is a set of lines that communicate signals between different parts of your computer. In this case, between the CPU and memory, the address bus. So an address is placed on the bus. The processor asserts that it wants to read from that address, and then memory does the process of looking up the contents of memory at the specified address and then placing that information on the data bus to transfer the information back to the CPU. This is a reasonable just so story. In reality, it's quite a bit more complicated, and there's a lot going on. But for right now, this is a pretty good picture. We're going to look into more detail of how all this works, but for right now, this will get you started. In the beginning, we had flat memory models. An address had some contents. When the computer wanted to read from that address, it went to that specific address and read the contents or set the contents at that address. That's basically how early memories worked. Now, that's not the full story. If you go back further, you'll find mercury delay loops and other kinds of memory, many different kinds of memory over the years. But for most of computing, there's been an address and there's been data associated with that address. A flat memory model is one in which the computer simply accesses a memory address directly, obtains the data at that address or writes data at that address, and can directly manipulate memory. This works well when things are small, or when you're in a very secure environment, or when you only have one process running. As an example of this, suppose we have multiple processes that all want to access memory at the same time. You can have contention for memory, and that can cause trouble. Or suppose you have a very large system and you've got a small memory bus. Now you've got a challenge of fitting lots of memory into a small address space, and that's a problem. So suppose that you have a 64K address space. The Apple II that we saw on the previous slide did, the Commodore 64 does. The Apple had much less than 64K of memory, so that was okay. The RAM and the ROM and devices that were mapped into memory could all fit into that 64K address space. But for the Commodore 64, we have a problem. There's RAM, I believe there's 8K of RAM. There's ROM, there's 64K of ROM. And then there are some memory mapped devices. The sound chip, the SID chip, and some other things are memory mapped. That all leads to the conclusion that we need more than 64K, right? Because we have to have a place in the address space for all the 64K of memory, then for the 8K of ROM, and then for all the different device stuff. And that's a problem. So how do we fit all that within just 64K of address space, right? I can only address 64K. I only have 16 address lines, but I have more than 64K of things to address. What the Commodore 64 did was something called bank switching. So I would have, for example, I could have a 4K bank that contained ROM, and I could switch that out, and I could switch it out for 4K of RAM, and I could do that with different banks throughout the system. And in fact, I could write to ROM, and I would, quote, write through, unquote, the ROM and write into RAM. So writes always took me to RAM, but reads would either be from the ROM or the RAM, depending upon how the bank switching was configured. This begins to take me down the road to thinking of addresses as virtual things. Sometimes an address refers to ROM, sometimes that same address refers to RAM. So what's to stop me from carrying that picture on until basically all addresses are virtual, and maybe an address that I'm looking at could refer to anything. Fully virtualized addresses. Well, that does happen eventually in 1966. In 66, this paper, Program and Addressing Structure in Time-Sharing Environments, came out, and it basically describes the way modern computers work. It talks about paging, physical pages, logical or virtual pages, page tables, all the things that we see today in 1966. So, to make all this work, you need to do some work. You need to do some translation of virtual addresses that the CPU wants to use into physical addresses that correspond to your actual physical memory. And the memory management unit is what's responsible for doing that. And it could be a separate device. In early computers, it was a separate system. Or it could be built into the chip itself. In modern processors, it's built in. So the memory management unit is responsible for translating virtual addresses into physical addresses. And there's huge advantages to this. Memory protection. In a flat memory model, maybe you can just read any old bit of memory and change it. That's not great for security. It's also not great for catching errors. What I would like to have is a system in which I can say this memory should be read-only, and this memory should be inaccessible, and this memory should be not executable. And I can do that with this memory management system. It helps with memory fragmentation. Memory fragmentation is a little difficult to explain, but not too bad. Imagine that I allocate a chunk of memory, and then I allocate a few small chunks, then I allocate another big chunk, and then a few more small chunks. Now, eventually I deallocate the small chunks, and I ask for another medium-sized chunk. And the sum of the small chunks would add up to that, but they're split up. They're divided up among these different spots in memory, so there's not a contiguous stretch that will satisfy that requirement, and I get an out-of-memory error, even though I do have enough memory to honor the request. Memory fragmentation is helped by this process because now I have these fixed size chunks, these pages. And so I construct a contiguous block of memory out of a potentially non-contiguous series of pages, because again, addresses are virtual things. So I can take a page here and a page there and a page somewhere else and plug them together as if they were contiguous memory. Which means that when I deallocate them and reallocate them and so forth, as long as I can find enough pages to satisfy the request, I can build a contiguous, quote-unquote contiguous, block of memory out of that and honor the request. Caching. Typically, this is where you get caching built into the system. Large memories are handled by this process because, again, the address space is virtual. Maybe every process has a 64K address space, but really I've got 256K of memory. That's okay, that will work. Error detection. I can catch a lot of bugs early thanks to memory protection. I compute a bad address and try to read from it, but there's no memory there. Nothing has been mapped there, and so I get an exception. Or I try to execute some stuff at memory, but that memory is not marked as executable. Those are ways of me finding out, usually through a segmentation fault, that I have a problem in my program. So the basic idea is divide memory into pages and keep track of those pages. How do we keep track of them? We use a page table to keep track of them. So here's what happens. The processor wants data, or it wants to write data to a virtual address. This has to be converted to a physical address so that the work can actually be done. First, the translation look-aside buffer is checked. We'll get to what that is a little bit later on, but basically it's a fast way to do the conversion. If I've done a conversion from a virtual address to a physical address, I cache that conversion in the translation look-aside buffer, so the next time I want to do it, I just look it up super fast and don't have to do the conversion. If I find the virtual address in the translation look-aside buffer, I'm done. If not, then I have to do some work to convert a virtual address into a physical address. Once I've done that, I communicate with the cache controller to get the associated data that may come out of the cache. It may trigger a request all the way out to DRAM. Now, here's something to keep in mind. A cache hit is fast. A cache miss that goes all the way out to DRAM is way slower. Now, why is memory access problematic? Why is it slow? What's going on here? It should be simple, right? Well, let's think about what's actually in it. Now, in class, I will skip this section, but here we're going to go through it. You're free to skip it. You can skip through this part of the lecture. It's an aside. It's not super important. And if you want to skip through it on the slide, you can just click the skip button. But we're going to go through it here. The way this is done in the AMD 64 and the x86, and in fact most modern processors, is through the use of page tables. A page table takes an address, a virtual address, and converts it into a physical address through several levels of indirection. Again, there are lots of addresses, and so a page table would have to be a huge thing if we wanted to allocate just one, right? I'm going to allocate one page table to handle all address translation. Well, that's kind of absurd. I don't want to do that because I have to allocate too much memory. So ideally what I'll do is I'll allocate additional bits of a page table as I need it. And the way I'll do that is through a sequence of indirections. Typically, the addresses that I'll want to access will all be grouped. There'll be clumps of addresses I'll want to access. And so it makes sense for me to define page tables based on clumping together the addresses. This would make more sense if we had more time to go into it, but I think that will give you the basic idea. Instead of allocating everything up front, I will allocate page tables as I need them, and I'll allocate them so that they cover common regions of an address space. It'll make sense in a minute. Now, remember, the page tables have to live in memory. They live in physical memory. So I got to be able to find the page tables. Now, there are a couple different ways to do it. I could say, well, the first page table occurs at a known fixed address, like address 0. But maybe I don't want that. Maybe something about the architecture means I need to use address 0 for something. Some processors put special stuff at address 0, like they put some processors actually have bit addressable memory there. Some of them will trigger different kinds of events when you read it. Some put vectors there. So I want to decide where to put it somewhere in memory. And on the AMD 64 architecture, the way that I specify where the first page table is located is I have a special register, CR3, which holds the physical address. It actually holds not a virtual address like most registers do, but the physical address of the level 1 page table. So CR3 is a 64-bit register or a 48-bit register, we'll get to that, which holds the physical address of the level 1 page table. We can get its contents. We could move CR3 into RAX, another register, and work with it that way, but we will only allow it to access CR3 if we are in ring 0. Okay, that is, we're running in the kernel. So we have to be in a privileged level of the processor in order to access CR3. It's a protected register. And lots of reasons for this we won't go into. So here's how that works. Up at the top, you see our 48-bit address. And you may wonder, why is it 48 bits? I thought addresses were 64 bits. No, they're not. They're actually 48 bits. The last few bits are just a copy of bit 47. And you could play around and see that, but that's in fact how it works. 48 bits on most modern processors. Some have a little fewer bits than that, but for example, the machine I'm using to write these slides uses a 48-bit address space. Now, the bottom 12 bits specify the location in a page. A page is typically 4096 bits. 4096 bytes, 4K. How many bits do I need to specify an offset into a 4K thing? Well, 1K would be 10 bits. So 2K is 11 bits and 4K is 12 bits. So I need 12 bits. So the bottom 12 bits will specify an offset into a 4K page. For the pedants out there, there can be other page sizes. There are a couple of the page sizes that are supported by the Intel processor. Occasionally they are used on some architectures, but for the most part you can think of a page as being 4K, and that's just almost universally true. Page is 4K almost everywhere and almost all processors, but there are other page sizes out there in the world. So 12 bits will give me the specific byte address inside the page. So forget about those 12 bits. CR3 tells me the physical location of the level 1 page table. So that is itself one page. It's 4K. The level 1 page table is 4K. How many addresses can I put in a 4K page table? Well, an address is 8 bytes. It's 64 bits. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, you just told me it's only 48 bits. You just told me the low 12 bits are only used for offsets. So really, what you're telling me is I only need 36 bits. What about the other bits? Those other bits are used for permission flags and other information. But basically, a single entry is 8 bytes. How many 8-byte entries can I have in a 4096 byte page? Well, you do the math and you wind up with 512. I can have 512 entries in there. But Stacy, you can have more than 512 pages, that you will need on a computer. Sure, we'll get to that. So for right now, the level 1 page is pointed to by CR3. That's a physical address, and I use the level 1 page index to give me a specific entry. There are 512 entries, so I need 9 bits to specify one of those entries. So I take the high 9 bits, and that specifies a particular entry in the level 1 page table, and that gives me another physical address, namely the address of a level 2 page, not the level 2 page, right? There can be up to 512 different level 2 pages. This points me at the particular level 2 page that I need, and it gives me the physical address of that level 2 page. Great. Another 512 possible entries. I use the level 2 page index to pick one of those entries, which points me to a level 3 page. Again, the physical address of the level 3 page. I use the 9 bits there to give me an offset into that. That points me to a level 4 page. And now I use the level 4 page index to pick an entry out of that. And that is the actual physical address of the page I'm looking for. There we go. So now we have the address of the start of that 4K page, and now the last 12 bits can be used to provide an offset to a particular byte within that page. So you can see how the system works. At the first level, CR3 always points me to the same place. Those first 9 bits, the highest 9 bits, basically point me to a level 2 page table, right? And I can have multiple of those. Make sense? And then the next 9 bits point me to one of the level 3 page tables, the next 9 to a level 4 page table. There's only one level 1 page table, but there can be several level 2s, level 3s, and level 4s, so I can have far more than 512 pages mapped. But I only allocate the tables as I need them, so I'll use up pages as I need them, and those pages, I only have as many as I need, and they tend to be clustered together around a particular address. All right. So now I've gone from a virtual address up at the top to an actual physical address in physical memory. This takes a while. You might think this seems like that would take a while. Well, typically these particular pages with the page tables will be in cache, so I won't have to go too far to find them. But yeah, even though they're in cache, this can take a while, and we'll see why in a moment. To speed this up, the processor uses a translation look-aside buffer. So it caches those 36 bits at the top. Doesn't need to cache the full 48, just the 36, right? Because only those 36 bits were used to get the start of the page in physical memory. And it caches those 36 and the address of the physical memory that we got out the other side. So now I can take those first 36, map it directly to that, and then I can add the 12-bit offset in order to get a particular byte. That's the purpose of the translation look-aside buffer. It makes this whole process much faster if I've done it before. Now, once I've done this, the next thing to do is to check the cache, and I check the L1 cache. The L1 cache is the closest, fastest, and smallest cache. On the processor I'm using right now, the L1 cache has 32K of storage and a 64-byte cache line. That's pretty common. And it is 8-way set associative. So I don't want to get into the different cache styles, but the world has gradually settled on using set associative cache because it avoids thrashing, and it's not too complicated. It can be done quickly. Watch a video on cache if you want to know what set associative caching is. Anyway, the point is, I divide the cache up into sets, and each set can contain a number of lines. And 8-way set associative says 8 lines, or 8 64-byte things per set. So I wind up with my 32K, I wind up with 64 sets. So here's what I do. I take the bottom 6 bits. Why 6 bits? Because I want to address one of the 64 bytes, and I need 6 bits to address into a 64-byte array. So the bottom 6 bits tell me which byte. The next 6 bits tell me which set. Remember, I have 64 sets. This tells me which one of the sets to look in. And then the remaining giant block of bits there are the tag. The 36 bits I will look for in that set, and if I find it, I will have found the thing I want. I'll have found the string of 64 bytes, and I'm good. I have a cache hit. What about those last 4 digits there that are outside of any box? Well, those aren't used. Just unused bits. All right. So what if I don't find the tag in the L1 cache? Well, I try the L2 cache. The L2 cache is slower, but it is also larger. On the machine I'm working on right now, it is 256K in size. I'm still using 64-byte cache lines, so now I have 4,096 lines in total. And I'm still 8-way set associative, so I have 8 lines per set. So 4,096 divided by 8 gives me 512. So I have 512 sets. So as we already know, I'll need 9 bits for that. So now the block offset is 6 bits to index into one of the 64 bytes. The index for the set is now 9 bits because there are 512 of them, and the remaining 33 bits are the tag that I will look for to find the entry in the cache. So what if it's not in the L2 cache? Well, then I go all the way out to the L3, or the last level of cache. Now, things get tricky here because the L3 cache is shared among all the different cores, but a lot of it is still the same. It's much larger, so on the machine I'm using right now, it's 8 megabytes. I still use the 64-byte cache line, so now I have 131,000 lines. And now I'm 16-way set associative, so there are 16 lines per set. More opportunities for me to have a cache hit, but also more lines to check for the tag. Alright, block offset still 6 bits because 64 bytes. The index is now 13 bits because I have 8,192 sets. And then the remaining 29 bits are the tag that I will search for to get a cache hit. This all sounds fine and good, but at this level I have the complication that I'm sharing it. Now, let's think for a minute about consistency. Each of the cores has a L1 and an L2 cache. Suppose core 1 has address X, and suppose core 2 also uses address X. So they have address X in both their caches. And now processor 1 wants to write to address X, and does. When that's over, what does processor 2 see? Well, does its cache have the old value? Does it know that a new value has been written? How is it notified of that? How does it deal with that? Right? How do I keep different cores consistent about memory? Well, it turns out we need protocols to do that. And there are a number of protocols that are used, but the most common ones that we'll care about are these two right here. Intel uses the Modified Exclusive Shared Invalid Forward, or MESIF protocol, different states that things can be in. AMD uses the Modified Owned Exclusive Shared and Invalid protocol. Two different protocols accomplish much the same thing. Older versions will use simpler versions of these. A lot of ARM processors use MOSI, but some, like the Cortex A9, use the simpler Modified Exclusive Shared Invalid, or MESI protocol. And this is developed at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, so it's known as the Illinois protocol. There you go. We're not going to get into the details of all this. I've got links down in the links in the author notes. Go crazy if you want to dig into this, but we're not going to get into it here. What about DRAM? DRAM can be a complex and sophisticated little beast. In fact, DRAM can be its own little computer. But for the most part, you don't want it to be. Even so, DRAM has to do some work to read memory. And the less work you have to do every time you read memory, the better. So one way in which DRAM, in a sense, caches things, when you send it an address, it then opens that line for reading, and you can read from it. So it would be great if what DRAM did was sort of keep that line open, so that if the next request is for the same line, it doesn't have to do anything. That line's already open. You bypass that part of the process and you read from that line. And often you are doing consecutive reads from the same region of memory. So it makes sense for DRAM to keep that line open. So opening a line requires doing some stuff with electrical fields. I wonder if keeping a line open will give me a way to exploit memory errors so I can do nefarious things. Sure, of course it does. It's called row press, and you can read about it there. We're not going to get into it here. Well, hopefully not often. You eventually read from DRAM. Maybe you are memory mapping a file, and that triggers a readout to a SSD. God help you, maybe you go out to a spinning hard drive or a mag tape, or to a cabinet that has to have a robot mount a tape, whatever, right? As you get farther out, you get larger, but also slower, mass storage. That's just the way of the world. All of this has to get managed. And as you've already seen, Managing this requires a lot of work, right? I've got to implement these protocols for cache. I have to do all this indirection through page tables. I have to manage the translation look-aside buffer. Just think of if you write down all the steps of the process as you go through it, you're like, wow, that's a lot of stuff to do. And it is, in fact, a lot of stuff to do. You basically need another computer to do the things you need to do to access memory. In fact, we've built up a process for accessing memory that basically requires another general purpose computer to implement it. And in fact, the x86 MMU is Turing complete. What does that mean? What does it mean for the memory management system to be Turing complete? It means that just that piece is capable of general purpose computing. And in fact, what you're seeing over on the right hand side of the screen is a video where no instructions are being executed, but a computer is playing, in this case, Conway's Game of Life, and it's doing it without executing instructions. All that's happening is you're generating page faults, which are causing the memory management system to do some work, and that work results in playing Conway's Game of Life. It's absolutely fascinating how this works. Feel free to look into it. You do just a little bit of setup, and then you kick off a memory request, which triggers a cascade of page faults, which trigger more page faults, which do all the computation for you. No other instructions ever run on the processor. All right, so we're done with the aside. Let's get back to the main topic. By now, you hopefully have a general appreciation for the idea that accessing memory is hard, and it can take a long time. And depending upon how things were set up, if stuff is in local cache, or in the last level cache, or not in cache, you can pay a fairly high penalty for it. So, the processor is always trying to do work, right? It's trying never to be idle. Suppose you hire an intern, and you give the intern a series of things to do. And let's say the first thing requires that they go and get some papers from the library. So they go, they contact the library agrees to send them PDFs of the papers, but it'll take a little while, and so they have to wait. And the next thing is they need to reach out to somebody else and get some data from them. So they send an email to that person to get their data. Okay, they're stuck, right? They're waiting. Either they're waiting for the papers to come, or they're waiting for the guy to send them data, and they're just going to sit there at their desk. Well, they're not going to do that, because you might walk by and wonder why they're just sitting at their desk or playing Minecraft or doing whatever they're doing, and why aren't they working? So they move on to the next thing, and they try to do the next thing that they can do that doesn't depend on getting the papers or getting the data. The processor does the same thing. The processor has places where it needs to do something that will take some time, like maybe read from memory. And while it's waiting for the memory result to get back to it, it can possibly do other work. And so it tries to do that. And sometimes work that you want to do depends on the other stuff that you need, right? The student is blocked from doing certain things until they get the data back from that person. They can't do anything until they get the data. So they're stopped. That's a dependency chain, right? They are depending on that data before they can do the next thing. But if they can move some other tasks up, they can do those while they're waiting for that data. Modern processors do a little bit of flow analysis. They can't do sophisticated flow analysis, right? They don't have the information the compiler did. They don't have the information the assembler did. They have to just work with what they have. And they do a little bit of simple data flow analysis, and they do a little bit of instruction rewriting. We'll see that. And they do this so that they can move instructions around and try to fill up the pipeline with work. So, modern processors convert instructions into MIPS-like microoperations. MIPS. MIPS is basically a RISC processor. So what's happening is these complex instructions, right? The x86 is a CISC, a complex instruction set architecture computer. But underneath it, it's basically running a bunch of low RISC processors that do the work. And so we take one of these complex instructions and we break it down into micro operations. So instead of trying to reorder the whole big instructions, we now have these micro operations, and we can maybe reorder them a little better. They give us new opportunities to do some reordering. Modern instruction pipelines can be 20 to 30 stages. I think most recently it's 31 stages. So there's a lot of opportunity to do things out of order. Now, as an interesting historical aside, the processor over there on the right is the next gen 586. It came out in 1994. It was the first x86 with out-of-order execution, and it could reorder up to 14 micro-ops. That's pretty cool. It's so cool that AMD purchased the company the next year. So you might think to yourself, wow, that's cool. That was in 1990. Is that the first processor or the first computer that could do out-of-order execution? No. The first one was the CSC6585 in 1964. And it used an algorithm called the scoreboard algorithm. Modern machines use Tomasulo's algorithm. If you want to know about those, there are links to click to go and find out more. But modern processors use some variant of Tomasulo's algorithm in order to do this. And you can read about it at that link. If you're super curious, this is all out of scope. But let's think about what out-of-order execution really looks like. I mean, we've talked about it. We talk about these things in the abstract, but let's actually get a concrete example to look at. So over on the right, we see a little 4 instruction assembly sequence at the top. Here's what that's doing. This is in the Intel vernacular. So there's different ways to write assembly code for the x86. I'm not going to go too much in detail, but basically there's an Intel dialect, and this is written in the Intel dialect. Or sometimes it's called flavor. It's written in the Intel flavor. And the way that it works is you have a mnemonic, like MOV, which is move. Then you have destination, comma, source. So in this case, move, that first move instruction, will move the contents of memory at location X into the register RAX. So it loads RAX from address X. The next thing is it does an integer multiplication of the contents of RAX in 5, storing the result back in RAX. Then it loads RAX, then it adds the contents of RAX to the value stored at location Y and stores the result back in RAX. And then finally, it stores the contents of RAX at the address Z. Those 4 things. So we can break them down into micro-ops, and most of them are simple, right? We fetch the contents of address X and put it in RAX. We multiply the contents of RAX by 5 and put that in RAX. Those are both just simple one-op micro-ops. For the next one, we break it into 2 micro-operations. I fetch the contents of address Y and I put it in temporary register R1. Then I add RAX and R1 and store the result in RAX. And then finally, I store RAX in Z. So I started out with 4 instructions. Now I have 5 micro-ops, and I can reorder these micro-ops, which can break apart instructions. It can move parts of instructions separately from each other. And so what I would like to do typically is move the fetches up, and that lets me put other faster instructions in that gap right after the fetch. So you can see I do a fetch X into RAX. So anything that depends on RAX is now blocked. It's waiting for that fetch to complete. But I don't need that in order to do the fetch from Y into R1. So I'll slide that in and do that next. Now I am blocked because I need RAX in order to do the next instruction. So I wait for that to complete, and then I do that multiplication. Then I add RAX and R1, right? And I'm blocked there until R1 gets back. and then I store the result in Z. Is that better than what we had above? Yeah, it is, because you can see the fetch has moved up, so we can go ahead and execute it, whereas in the one at the top, it's blocked, waiting for that multiplication to get done, which is waiting on the fetch to get done. Alright, so that's one way in which this can be done. Another thing the processor can do is rename stuff. So there's a program analysis technique that we won't get into here, but it's basically a way to rewrite variables so that you can do analysis without having to worry about their values changing. It's something called static single assignment. And if you want to know more about it, take the reverse engineering class. A small bit of that shows up in the way the processor interprets things. So look at the top. At the top we have 6 instructions. We have the move, the integer multiplication, and another move. Those all use RAX. I put a value in RAX from memory, I multiply it by 6, and I put that back into memory. Then I use RAX again for a different thing. I look at a different location, possibly. I put that value in RAX. I add 2 to it, and then I store that back at a different location. And we'll assume W, X, Y, and Z are all distinct locations. Or at least we'll assume that X and Y are distinct locations. So what I have is I have the top 3 instructions use RAX. The bottom 3 use RAX. I can't do anything on the bottom until the top is done because I need to wait because I want to use RAX for this. Well, what if I didn't have to use RAX? What if I could rewrite that so I used a different register? Because they really are, if they really are independent, I should be able to do that. In fact, the processor does that. It has multiple copies of RAX, and you can see down below, I've labeled them. So now I have RAX-A and RAX-B, and you see this middle piece, all I've done is rewrite them so that I use RAX-A for the first ones and RAX-B for the second ones. But because RAX-A and B are now independent, I can now move stuff around, and you can see at the bottom, I've done that. I've moved the moves up so that I can go ahead and do the IMUL and the add, and then do the stores. So I've reordered the instructions. And that helps me further optimize the program at runtime. But notice, if it turns out X and Y are not independent, I can get in trouble doing this, so I've got to be a little careful. One more kind of minor thing. The page table system has permission bits. So once I've converted a virtual address into a physical address, once I've done this work, the processor can check whether the current process meets whatever the requirements are to be able to access that memory. And if I don't have permission to access it, it can generate an exception. Now, keep in mind, things can change, right? I can request and get permission. You can modify the permission bits on things through kernel operations like mmap, so things can change. But basically, if I don't have permission, I can't get access to it. The great thing about this is processor level security. Okay? The processor enforces this. This means that I don't have to worry about code being right or wrong, or instructions that get executed. The processor makes a guarantee here that the permission bits in the page table will be honored, and you will not get access to memory you shouldn't have access to. And that's great. That's very powerful. That means that it is safe for me to do things like map the kernel and its working memory into the address space of every process. That's what you do. That is super helpful, kind of a reasonable and obvious thing to do. The entire kernel and its working memory are mapped into the address space of every process on Linux. And that's okay because you're protected by the memory subsystem. Your process, an unprivileged process, can't read kernel memory and certainly can't write kernel memory because it doesn't have permissions to do that. Never going to get through it. Processor level security, unbreakable. So here's how you break it. We go through a process where, suppose, we flush the cache. So we pick a set of cache lines. Remember, cache lines are these 64-bit clumps. We pick cache lines and we flush those. So they're removed, they're written out, they're removed from the cache, and the cache is freed up there. That turns out to be an unprivileged instruction, so I can just do it. I just do a CL flush and I move those things out of memory. And then I do something. I do something slow. I reach out, let's say, to an address that I know is not in the cache. So now the processor has to go all the way out and get it. It's not in the translation look-aside buffer, so it has to do the laborious calculation to get it and go all the way out and get it from main memory and then bring it all the way back in, and that's going to take a little while, right? So while that's going on, the processor wants to do other stuff, and so I give it other stuff to do. I have it read from a location that is in cache. For example, the kernel, right? Kernel memory and the kernel's working memory is probably in the cache. So I ask it to read from these protected bits of memory. Now, there's memory protection, but, now bear with me, it doesn't know that I'm not going to be able to do that because it's waiting for other things to happen. So it goes ahead and does the read, gives me back the result, and then I take action based on that. So one way I might take action is I might take that data and break it down into a series of ones and zeros, right, the bits that make up the data. And for each one of those I have a cache line. And I read from the cache lines, let's say, where I have a 1. And I don't read where I have a 0. By now the processor is caught up, decided I don't have access to that memory. Fine, it denies me. I catch that exception and I go on and do other things. So what's happened? The net effect of this is I didn't get to read the memory. I was denied it. But there was a side effect which creates a side channel. And that side effect is that the stuff I loaded based on the memory I couldn't see has modified the cache. So when I go back later, I can time my cache read. And if a cache read is slow, it's a 0, and if it's fast, it's a 1. And so I can then learn something about what happened during the instructions that were technically never executed because they got thrown away because I didn't have permission to access the memory. This, at least in theory, allows me to read from arbitrary memory addresses, but it sounds so contrived. It's not the kind of thing that could actually work, is it? Sure it is. And it's called Meltdown, and it's a problem. You can read more about it there. This was a big thing back in 2017. There is mitigation for it. You can read about that. KPTI is the mitigation for it. It's beyond the scope of this class to get into that. But this allowed you to read kernel memory from within what we call user space. From unprivileged processes, we're able to reach out and read the kernel memory using this technique by exploiting out-of-order execution and cache timing. Meltdown has a CVE and there's a CWE associated with it, exposure of sensitive information to an unauthorized actor. This is another example of a side channel. There's lots of examples of side channels. In this case, it's a processor side channel that subverts the processor-based security that we were so confident in. All right, let's go back to security models. So last time we talked about Bell LaPadula, and we talked about BIBA. And the BIBA model, I think, may have seemed a little odd to some of you. In particular, this notion that I can read up, but I can't read down? That seems a little bit odd, right? Well, sure, I can read things that are at a higher level of integrity, but I can't read from things that are at a lower level of integrity. It can feel wrong. When you think about it, it does make sense, but it seems kind of odd. And part of that may be we have this very strict hierarchy here. Everything is at these specified levels, and it's all centrally controlled and centrally managed. So what if we tried to break things up? Instead of just mapping out all of the subjects and the objects and using this tranquility principle to make sure everything is fixed, maybe what we can do is we can break things up and treat them as a number of smaller problems. Now, the nice thing about the Biba model is it has a lot of absolutes, and that makes it easy to prove some very strong things. So whatever we do from this is going to require that we do a lot more work to prove things are true, but it may be more useful. Remember utility from the Parkerian hexad. All right. So if we have the right set of assumptions and we have the right set of constraints, perhaps we can build a better model. What we're talking about now is a change management model. A change management model focuses on what subjects are allowed to do to objects and the ways in which they can make changes to those objects. We still want to limit the interaction, right? We still don't want you reading secret stuff, but we can perhaps define your relationship to object A and object B and object C in different ways, and maybe even do some stuff like give you a little control over that. The Clark-Wilson model came out after Bell LaPadula and Biba, and it sort of builds on what Biba had done, but breaks things up a little differently. Within the Clark-Wilson model, there are these 3 integrity goals, and they're pretty obvious when you think about them. The first one is no changes to objects by unauthorized subjects. Wow, okay, sure, right? You're not authorized for this. You're not even a user. What are you doing? How can you change things? Bad. No unauthorized changes to objects by authorized users. Yeah, sure, you're logged into the system. We know who you are. You have an account here. That's all well and good. But you can't add other users. You're not allowed to do that. And then maintain both internal and external consistency. And that's a really critical piece. What might that look like? Well, on Linux systems, I typically have a password file that specifies some information about a person's account, and a shadow password file that holds the hashes for the passwords. May seem weird that password doesn't hold passwords and shadow holds passwords, but that's just how we do things these days. If those get out of sync, it can cause problems, right? So for example, suppose I delete a user from the password file, but I don't delete their hash. Weird things can happen as a result of this. The system becomes inconsistent, and that's bad. So, in order to make sure that things behave correctly, that we honor all the constraints, and that the system stays consistent, we define transaction procedures. What's a transaction procedure? It's code. It's a piece of code we run. So we define this. We say, well, you should be allowed to, let's say, print a certain object. Here's code that will do that. That code is a transaction procedure. We then say, this subject wants to print this object. So for example, Doug wants to print object A. And we plug those in, and that should give us a well-formed transaction. Then we can do an evaluation to figure out if that's something that should happen, and if it is, we can then execute that transaction, and we will have verified or at least certified the transaction, so we can be consistent that when that transaction is complete, the system is left in a stable, consistent, secure state. So, to get to these transaction procedures, we need someone to write them, but we also need someone to prove their correctness, the person who certifies them. And ideally, those are different people for a lot of reasons. So, you can write code, And you can read the code, and it can look right to you because you're going through the same mental process when you read it that you were going through when you wrote it, and so you make the same errors, and the code looks right to you. But if another person looked at it, they might spot the error. So ideally, the implementer and the certifier are different people, and that leads to the principle of separation of duties. It's a common principle just across the whole world of security. If you're setting up a secure information facility, you're going to need someone to design it, someone to approve it, someone to maintain it, someone to audit it, and those need to be separate people. If they were all the same person, there could be a lot of room for mischief or a lot of room for error. So you want them to be different people that cross-check each other's work. Same principle here. Now, this could be a problem. We have all these data items. We can only access them through well-formed transactions. Geez, what about just email? I want to send an email. I want to, something simple. Well, what we'd like to have is some data that is not constrained in this way. Some data has to be protected. We'll call those constrained data items, or CDI. But other data doesn't have to be. We'll call that unconstrained data items, or UDI. And access to protected items is by provably correct transactions, and those ensure that all these security properties are maintained. What about unconstrained? Well, maybe you can just sort of arbitrarily access those and mess with them, so on. At some point, though, we might have to do something with them, and in that case, we'll have to revisit that. But for right now, let's just think what we do with these data items. We have a subject, we have a program that implements the TP, and we have an object that we want to work on, or maybe multiple objects we want to work on. And we can think of that as a triple. Some user wants to apply some TP to a particular object. So we have to think about what that all means. Ideally, again, if we've proven the correctness, we've proven the properties of the transaction of the TP, because we trust the initial CDIs, because we verified the TP, we can then trust the resulting CDIs, right? Because the result of this might be a transformed CDI. I might take an object, apply a TP to it, yielding a new object. Or maybe I take multiple objects and apply a TP to them, yielding a new object. And again, I trust the initial state, I trust the transaction, therefore I can trust the result. That's the basic line of argumentation. We might want to try to apply one of our TPs to a UDI, but we don't necessarily trust those. They aren't necessarily at the same level of trust. It's untrusted data. Believe it or not, the Linux kernel does this. The Linux kernel knows something about where things come from. If you look at some Linux code, you may see like user tags on certain functions or certain data. That means that data came from the user and is less trustworthy. All right, so we have these unconstrained data items. We can interact with them, but if we want to use those and import them into the system, we might want to design a CDI that takes an unconstrained data item as input and produces a constrained data item as output that can then go in our set of constrained data items, and we can then work forward from that. We could also imagine a situation in which a TP takes a constrained data item and generates for us an unconstrained data item, perhaps that we can export. So all these things can be designed and done. We just have to do all the hard work of verification. We also have to make sure the system stays in a good state. And for that we use an integrity verification procedure. So periodically the system can check its own consistency and make sure it's still valid. What does that look like? Well, imagine we have a set of constraints on the CDIs. We'll see what those look like in a minute. The idea being that this set of constraints As long as we can prove that each constraint in that set is satisfied, we can conclude that the entire system is consistent and in a state such that our security and integrity requirements are met, TPs work as expected, and yield valid CDIs out the other side. Everything's going to work just fine. What do constraints look like? Well, let's say that you're a bank. And let's say that at the end of the day, you have an ending balance for a person's bank account. We'll call that EB. Now, that's going to be the starting balance the next day. The person's going to deposit some money. Let's set the total of deposits so far be D. They're going to withdraw some money. Total withdrawals are W. And then at any time, we have a current balance. We have 4 data items: the ending balance, total deposits, total withdrawals, and the current balance. An integrity constraint would look like what you see at the bottom there. The ending balance plus the deposits minus the withdrawals should be the current balance. If it's not, something has gone wrong. As long as it is, we meet that particular constraint, we have at least partially satisfied ourselves that the system is in a consistent state. Now, for all this to work, we do need one more level of separation. We need administrators. In the past, we had a very top-down, very static model for this. Bell LaPadula and Biba both have this very static view, this very top-down view of how that's done, right? In fact, we have a principle for that. We have tranquility, right? Strong and weak tranquility. Here, we want to be a little more flexible, so we have what's called a take-grant model. An administrator who has extra privileges can grant a subject or a user rights and authorizations and can revoke those rights and authorizations. Great. We've had that before. That's basically what we already had. The trick here is that then the subject can take, grant, or revoke rights subject to the rights they've already been granted. This might mean that I am given access to a particular object and I am allowed to add other people to that object, to give other people access to that object. So some part of the control of this can be distributed to the different subjects that are part of the system. Well, what if I want to give access to someone who shouldn't have access? That's what the constraints are for, right? The constraint would then say, you want to give Bob access to this top secret data, but Bob doesn't have a top secret clearance. That's going to trip this consistency constraint and be disallowed. Or that's going to be built into the well-formed transaction, and it's going to say, no, you can't do that. You can't give Bob access to this. Okay? So, there you go. The Clark-Wilson model has a lot of moving pieces, but you can fit most of this stuff on a slide. There's a nice succinct description that I stole from Wikipedia. And it has certification rules and enforcement rules. And you can walk through this. There's nothing too super complicated here. Implementing this is, there you go. You implement this and you're good, right? Security achieved. Does this solve our problem? Well, I did mention top secret earlier, but it didn't seem to directly address that. It's really focused on integrity, same as the Biba model was. But we want confidentiality. We really want confidentiality. So, wait a minute. Well, we're relying on verification for this, relying heavily on verification for this. We're verifying the TPs. We're verifying the integrity verification procedure. We are applying these constraints, and we're assuming something about the ensemble of constraints and what satisfying those constraints means. There's a lot going on here. Verification of software is not easy. You can prove a particular algorithm is correct, but there are a lot of assumptions that will go into that proof. And some of those might turn out later to be wrong. Remember, security is weird. It decays. So I proved the correctness of my algorithm. And then I put it through a compiler. And you've already seen how a compiler can throw away information and produce insecure code out the other side, despite the fact that you worked extra super duper hard to make it secure. So there's a lot of assumptions that go into it, and verifying the correctness of software is fraught. This is not a verification class. We're not going to get into all that, but there's a lot to cover there. The Clark-Wilson Light model sort of says, okay, verification is hard. Do rigorous testing. Yeah, even that is fraught, right? Because what does that mean? Am I going to do statistical testing? So I have statistical certification of these? That's great, but that sort of protects me to something about randomness and averages, and not necessarily a lot about security, because security tends to be non-random. Anyway, lots of challenges in making all of this work. Even consistency is a challenge. So we build our set of constraints, and we have to be careful about that, and maybe we can use model checkers or other tools to try to show that our set of constraints is good. But even then, we might fall prey to the fact that we're implementing it on a computer. So remember our integrity constraint from banking? EB, the ending balance plus the deposits minus the withdrawals is the current balance. What if deposits is negative, right? We deposit negative money. I mean, nothing prevents me from, as far as I know, from having different signed integers. Or what if I overflow something? Or underflow? Or what if I'm using floating point math? Then everything is a mess. So there could be lots of problems there, and that requires more proofs and some fairly sophisticated ones, especially if I want to use floating point numbers, which I probably don't for banking, for lots of good reasons. I probably don't want to use floating point numbers when I'm doing financial calculations. All right. Enough of that. Let's switch gears here and talk about access control. So, and this will be important for the upcoming models and for some other stuff. And we'll begin by talking about the matrix. In particular, the access control matrix. So, the basic idea is I want to think about the permissions that are being granted to subjects with respect to objects. And I can do that by organizing all of this conceptually into an access control matrix. I'm not going to build the whole matrix. That would be crazy. But we can think about it conceptually. It gives us a way to reason about it. And over here you see subjects are rows. So JKnight is that first row. And the objects are columns. So you can see Mordu is that first column. And that's some object in the system. So JKnight's a user. Mordu is let's say a file. What permissions does JKnight have with respect to Mordu? Well, read and execute. He can read Mordu and he can execute Mordu. What about Sadie? Sadie has no permissions for Mordu. Can't read, can't write, can't execute. But Sadie can read Opal and can read and execute Cobra. All right. So a cell in the matrix, subject object, tells us something about the allowed access for that subject to that object. Okay? And there's another example here. We see C. Whitmore has read, write, and execute permissions for Mordu, read for Opal, and no permissions for Cobra. That's important. Let's think for a minute. C. Whitmore can write to Mordu. Mordu is something that JKnight can execute. So C. Whitmore can modify an executable that JKnight can run. So if C. Whitmore modifies Mordu, JKnight executes Mordu. JKnight also has read, write, and execute access to Cobra. Perhaps C. Whitmore can modify Mordu so that when JKnight runs it, it moves data from Cobra into, let's say, Opal. And Whitmore can read Opal. So here we have a case where Whitmore has no access to Cobra, but is able to read the contents of Cobra by mirroring it through something that she can read, like Opal. In addition, she could just have J Knight modify Cobra, putting bad data in it or doing something else like that. That's good because it also gives her deniability. She didn't change Cobra. She has no access to it. J Knight changed Cobra, and he has access to it. There you go. So this gives us a way to reason about permissions and think about things. And it's really just a conceptual tool. We don't try to implement this. What do we implement? Well, we implement access control lists, or ACLs. So an access control list you can think about as that column, each one of those columns there. So an access control list from Mordu contains a set of pairs. It contains a pair of user and permission. So J Knight has read execute, C Whitmore read write execute, and K Knight read execute. Sadie didn't have anything, so Sadie didn't even have to be in the access control list. We do the same thing for Opal, same thing for Cobra. ACLs are associated with the particular object. And ACLs originate in 1965. This is old stuff. Remember we mentioned Multics and the Orange Book a while back? Access control lists originate in Multics. Simple access control lists, you've been seeing them all this time, maybe not thinking that much about them, but when you do an ls-l on Linux, you see at the start the permissions for the user, the group, and everyone else. So, for example, up here, baton.so, the baton shared object, J Knight is the owner. He has read, write, and execute permissions for baton. The Starman group has read and write, but not execute permissions. And everyone else in the system can read, but they cannot write, and they cannot execute baton.so. There you go. And you can see these on Linux or the Mac with ls-l. What about Windows? Windows has the same kind of thing going on. So you can right-click on a file and open permissions. So in this case, you've opened the permissions for baton.dll. And you can see in that dialog over on the right, there's Starman, there's Jack Knight. So Starman is a group, Jack Knight's a user. There's system administrators. I've highlighted administrators, and you can see the administrators have full control. The file owner Jack Knight has read, write, and execute access, and members of the group Starman have read and execute access. You can't see that here. You have to click them to see it. It's a little less. It's both friendlier and less friendly in the way that Linux does it. And also you have permissions for the local administrator. It's the administrator on the machine Sanders. And the system user as well. The system group, I should say. Linux and Mac OS can also have more sophisticated ACLs. And a lot of people don't know this, but you can, in fact, do other stuff beyond the simple permissions. So here you can see from the uname command that I'm, in fact, running on a Linux. I do get facl baton.so, and it tells me, okay, the file is baton.so, the owner is J Knight, the group is Starman, here are the permissions for you, the group, and other. Well, okay, but I also want to have a group called baton users, and I want to give them read and execute access to baton. So I can now say set facl-m for modify. I give it a G to indicate that I'm going to give it a group. The group is baton users, and I give it read and execute permissions, and I'm modifying baton.so. So the next time I do get facl, you can see sure enough that that group shows up. And there you go. So I can add specific permissions for users and groups, and I can change them in different ways. Well, what if you're in more than one group? How do the permissions work for that? Well, the permissions are basically a union. So let's say I'm in one group that gives me read access and a different group that gives me write access. I have read and write access because I can satisfy each one somewhere through that path. That's kind of important. It could lead to issues. You have to think about that kind of thing. Maybe that's not what we want. Maybe we want something a little different. Well, we'll come back to that later on in the class. What about Mac OS? Well, Mac OS has the same thing. So you see up at the top, I did a uname, and I'm on Darwin, which is the name for the Macintosh operating system. I do an ls-le for baton.so, and you can see I get the usual stuff. I can then do a chmod plus a baton users, which is the group, allow read execute. And sure enough, next time I do it, I see the same line, but I additionally see that, also group baton users is allowed to read and execute. So very much the same way that it worked in Linux, same kind of thing. For Windows, we've already seen how that works. You just add a user or a group in that dialog and set their permissions accordingly. Capability lists, or C lists. So we've been organizing things by access control lists. A file has some properties. Those properties include information about who is allowed to access it and how they're allowed to access it. What if instead we did it the other way? What if instead we said, here is what J Knight is allowed to access or allowed to do? That would be what we call a capability list or a C list. Okay? Now, down at the bottom, we see that, whereas before we had 3 ACLs, one for Mordu, one for Opal, one for Cobra, down at the bottom we have 4, one for each of the 4 users that we have. C lists come along much later. They come along in 1974 in a Communications of the ACM paper, and they come along as a solution to a problem that we will eventually get to in this class and discuss. But for now, all you need to know, access control lists per file, capability lists per user. A C list can be thought of as analogous to a directory. It basically gives you the set of things you can see and the kind of visibility that you have for each user. Capability lists are in Linux. They're there. So, and in this case, it's often, you can think of capability lists for the user, for a process, or for a particular executable. That may seem a little bit weird, but sure enough, these things all can have capabilities associated with them. They can each be, right, everything can be a user, everything can be an object, etc. And so, for example, I can say getcap for ping, and it tells me, hey, ping has a capability, the capability for raw network access. And I'm like, okay, great. I can also go ahead and modify some stuff. So I'm going to modify the baton shared object file to add the capability to bind network services. And when I'm done, I can use getcap on baton, and I'll see that sure enough, it has that capability listed for it. That capability, by the way, allows it to bind to ports less than 1024 on the host. Do you want to see all the capabilities? Do a man capabilities and it'll show them to you. Same thing exists in Linux, same thing exists in Windows, implemented differently, of course, but it's basically in every OS some way there is a means of implementing capability lists. It's not as easily exposed to the end user, and if you think about it for a few moments, it will make sense, right? Files are typically owned by a user, so you can see and manage the ACLs for those files. But you shouldn't necessarily be able to manage the capability lists for users, right? Because you're a user, not typically multiple users. So you shouldn't get to set your own permissions. So it's a different kind of thing. On that previous slide, if I go back, you'll notice I had to use sudo to set the capabilities, right? I had to become an administrator to set capabilities for the obvious reason that ordinary users shouldn't be doing that. ACLs in this case end up being a better way to manage permissions for your files. Now, you may think the two are interchangeable, but you've already seen one way in which they're not. right? ACLs are the object-centered view, and a user has many objects. C-lists are a subject-centered view, and a user typically only has one subject view. So there's already a bit of a disconnect right there. And it will turn out that C-lists are useful in solving problems where ACLs are not, certain kinds of problems. We'll see those. There's homework due on Tuesday. The homework is to consider the Biba and Bell LaPadula models, just those two. And again, we have 3 containers. They have different levels of confidentiality, different levels of trust or integrity associated with them. And we have 3 subjects, Alice, Bob, and Eve. Alice has an active top secret clearance. Bob is secret. Eve has no active clearance. And they are all 3 reliable, but not considered to be highly reliable or to be unreliable. And what I want you to do then is build a table for the above with 1 row for each subject and 1 column for each container. Wow, that seems like the access control matrix we just talked about. Feels like that, doesn't it? Enter read, write, or none in each cell. So each cell should have something in it for each one of these. And I want you to do one of these for the Bell, the Padula, the Biba, and then I want you to consider both, right? And give me the combination of the 2. And you have to think a little bit about that last one. That's it.